Hello and welcome to Into the Light. I'm your host, Edina Mauvana. Today we have Cyn Grace. Cyn is also known as the Grey Strega. She's a tarot reader, spiritual educator, a writer, and poet based in Jersey City, New Jersey. With over 30 years of experience, she leads Tarot Church, a movement encouraging the use of tarot to uncover universal messages of divine clarity and connection as a means of enhancing one's personal connection with a higher power. This work covers across all faith practices, and she also hosts a collective reading daily, which really empowers others through her claircognizant insights. And she runs tarot class program that caters to novice and seasoned tarot readers alike. I am so excited because I have been listening to your collective readings. I find it really interesting because you talk about the divine union energies coming into divine union every day, in separation, energies coming into divine union and deep within divine union. And at first, I had to figure out what it was you were even talking about in the first place. That took me a couple days, I'm not going to lie, just to wrap my head around what was going on astrologically and then relating to what these energies are doing every day. I love the work that you do because I feel like so many of us are going along our what we're considering like spiritual awakening journey or whatever that might be for each one of us. And some people talk about twin flame unions or being in divine union with a partner or what that means on our healing journey. I am so curious about how your energy readings really work. Like, how do you explain it to people? And what do you say when you talk about this type of daily reading that you're doing? Because you're putting a lot of energy in it and time and hours every day to tell people about what's going on. So yeah, how do you describe it best?
I think it's a really great question. And I totally appreciate that it can sometimes be a little bit confusing because I know the way that I typically read as it relates to energy frequencies and relationality deviates from some other readers. And what's interesting about it is, and I also describe this a bit as my own connection to how my gifts, which is the claircognizance, which is often the more that I start reading into something, the more that I understand and can see. And originally, when I first started doing readings based around relationships, I was covering that base of those who are in union versus who are not. And as I kept reading for it, the best way I can describe the way that it's shown to me when I'm reading is it really does seem like an energetic like signature. And so we move in and out of that signature. And what's interesting about it, and one of the reasons that I consider it such a gift to be able to read to the collective, is because it also helps me understand what I'm recognizing as well. A lot of those messages that I see that come across, it's not, and I always like to point this out because I have a lot of questions of people saying, oh, if I'm in separation, is that a bad thing? If I'm in union, is that a good thing? I'm like, no, the answer is categorically not. It's all about orientation. And that's also how I read tarot. I always like to point out that the value of a tarot reading isn't so much what's going to happen. It's understanding where you are, and the understanding the why helps you orient and regulate in terms of where you need to go. So that ability of the way it was basically shown to me and the way that I often read for it now is I usually describe 3 different levels that we move in and out of. And we can also go through these in our own personal relationships. And that's that feeling of being in separation, that coming into divine union, then once existing within it. So when I read, I typically try to read across all of those frequencies. So I know that for that reason, my readings tend to be a little bit more long-winded because we're covering a lot of territory. And what's interesting about it is sometimes we'll find that the lessons that are occurring in separation, several days later or a week later, I'll immediately suddenly realize that I'm reading the same exact message that was in separation just a few weeks before, and vice versa. Like these messages or these lessons travel back and forth across the frequency.
Yeah, and tell me about how it works when you're reading for the collective, or who is the collective that you're reading? Because I noticed that phrase as you're scrolling through TikTok and whatever, and people will say, "Oh, my collective is the people who are feeling this," or "My collect." Yeah, can you tell me about how? Because I think a lot of us think of tarot reading as you're going to go to a reader and get a very person to person. Oh, is my whatever person the right one for me? Or am I going to get this job? And so you have to tune in on an individual level. But what I find really amazing about your work is that it really is about resonating with a large collective energy that's happening. And yeah, so I'm curious how you dive into who your collective is and what you're exactly reading for.
It's a very good question. And I like to argue, I always like to point out that I'm definitely not the person to claim the term collective. I know that there's a lot of other readers that do so too. The best way I like to describe collective is the fact that I like to recognize and identify that not everyone will resonate with what I'm reading for.
Mm.
Those who tend to resonate with it feel it often on a very acute level, even to the extent that they tell me that sometimes they can understand the messages coming through both where I'm talking about in separation and in divine union as it relates to different connections in their own personal lives. The best way I can describe it in terms of how I've seen it is that, and there's other spiritualists and mystics who have spoken about this, that energy has a tendency of moving together just in general. And so when you think about, and you will hear this a lot often when we see those who study reincarnation, they'll talk about the fact that even when energy reincarnates, there's typically a certain like frequency of energy or souls that carry with us. The best description that I can describe in relationality to what I'm seeing, and I always like to point out that I'm also uncovering that in the journey of reading for it, that ability of moving through and traveling together is how it's communicated to me. So it's almost, I like to think of it, I see it a bit like a comet. You can almost imagine a comet that's moving through the cosmos, and this is all the energy that's moving in that same direction. They're going through the same energetic lessons. They're
Mm.
navigating the same territory, as it will. And what's interesting about it is that the experience of the individual, like in that travel, will be very unique. It will be solely their own. But when
Mm.
you look at the collective whole of the journey, you can recognize the benchmarks or those same like waves, if you will, that almost show that we're traveling those same territories or those same lessons together in multifarious ways.
Yeah, I feel like for me, when I listen to your readings, it's like scenarios are happening in my life. Like I'm having issues. You're describing energetically why it's happening. And I'm like, oh yeah, that makes sense. That's why I'm feeling this conflict. And so I really enjoy that. And so tell me, like, what do you think makes your readings really different and your work different from the other readers and tarot people that people are listening to on TikTok and all of that? What makes your work and the way that you do it the most unique?
Absolutely. I always like to start, and I definitely don't believe I'm the most unique. I know so many countless readers, and I always like to say I don't trust a reader that doesn't follow other readers because I feel like each of us have such unique lessons and that the ability for us to learn from one another is just amazing and incredible. I do think that in relationality to the way that kind of sets me apart from other readers is I very much try to stay very neutral in relationality to not being overly subjective in terms of what I am reading for. That's actually one of the reasons that like I both read across all of those frequencies, and at the same time I put a lot of care and attention in trying to read for both masculine and feminine energy, bearing in
Mm.
mind that's not based on gender but what it feels most aligned to. I do think that, and I always describe this as a challenge, even when I'm teaching students the tarot, because often I'll have students say, come to me and say, what are the hardest people to read for? And I always tell them the two hardest people that you'll ever read for are those who are closely connected to you, because your paths are so close in proximity. It's hard to remove yourself from being subjective in that. It's hard to look at it from a neutral territory. And then I say the hardest one is the self, because
Mm.
the desire, the ego really wants to get that square peg into the round hole. They really want to see, you want to see the things that you want to see. So I feel that one of the things that I strive to do, and this is also actually very much in relationality to my work with Tarot Church as well,
Oh yeah.
is to try to convey the messages that I am receiving in such a way that they don't feel completely focused on just the feminine perspective, on just the
Mm.
masculine perspective, on just the perspective of someone who is single, or just the perspective of someone who's in partnership. So that is something that I strive for, and I consider that a part of my own personal practice. And that's something that I effectively work very hard to do when I'm doing my collective reads, which is why they tend to be so long.
Yeah, but that's amazing. And so I know you've been doing the tarot for over 30 years and you have this mission with creating Tarot Church. And I'm curious to know what made you create that and what are you trying to teach people and like what are people really getting out of their journey with tarot that you're really trying to bring in and help people learn and develop?
Absolutely. Great question. And it's interesting because, again, so much about the work that I do now is immediately related to the work that I do with my clients. And as it relates to the work that I do in Tarot Church, that came directly from the interaction points I was having with a lot of clients that were coming to me for tarot readings for the first time, or those who expressed interest. And when I would ask them what their trepidation was, I would frequently get a response stating, I'm a part of X faith practice. And
Mm-hmm.
I was always taught that this was wrong, or I don't want to do something that is counter or oppositional or is going to move me away from my faith system. And this was very shocking to me when I experienced it, because as someone who grew up with the tarot, I actually learned tarot from my mother, and my family traditionally has a Roman Catholic background. I never experienced or found anything in the tarot that is antithetical to any faith-based practice. And in fact,
Mm-hmm.
I actually think that one of the most beautiful gifts about the tarot is the fact that we actually don't even know the provenance of it. Our earliest historical records of the tarot are from about the 1400s. And we found it first popped up in Italy, but even the Italians don't claim ownership of it. It was literally written in a journal by a monk that they discovered that these cards were being utilized. And I think that
Mm-hmm.
is such a beautiful gift, because in that way, the deck itself and the system is universalized. Anyone can apply it. And my mission in creating Tarot Church was to help do that work in potentially destigmatizing the conception that tarot has a personal indoctrination system, or it's going to require you to move away from one's own higher power or faith practice. I find that it's quite the opposite. I find that the work that I do with both my students, anything that we're learning, it should build a deeper, more personal connection to what you already feel and what you already believe. When I feel like, again, I always like to point that out. The energy of a good guide is never one that tells you what to think. They tell you how to think, and they help you understand and build that closer relationship with the self. So that's a lot of the work that I try to do, both in the work I do with Tarot Church and also in the classes that I teach, helping others to learn the tarot so that they can so that they can utilize it in their own personal way or in their own personal practices.
Yeah, I love it because I feel like there's so much resistance with, like you said, anything in the realm of divination or this like witchcraft, and it's in that sort of grouping. And I come from a Muslim background, and anything approaching magic and dark tarot has a very negative connotation. And that is one reason why, as I was on my TikTok journey, it's not like I want to go in and get a one-to-one reading, but when I'm listening to what you're saying, it just feels in alignment with it's not very balanced. You're covering how masculine energy is feeling and feminine energy, and it just feels like very in alignment with what's going on. And I found it to be a great thing to listen to and to understand more about how tarot works without it just being this like fortune teller like mentality right around it. And yeah, so I absolutely love that. And I'm wondering what you say to women who are concerned that maybe, oh, does that mean that we're interfacing with demonic spirits or spirits that are not that are we're not supposed to be interacting with, and that's what's bringing you this information? What do you say when people are asking you those kinds of questions?
I think it's a great question. One of the things I also try to do, and I'm also someone who in my own personal work, I refer to myself as a mystic. I'm someone who finds that there's a inherent beauty in all religious practices. And I firmly believe that the things that unify us are far more great and wonderful than the things that separate us. And whenever I look at any faith-based practice that talks about this idea of demonology, it always seems to spring from fear. It
Mm.
always seems to have that association of moving from fear or something that creates fear within the self. And so I'll even immediately say to someone, if someone says to me, I'm afraid of this, I say, then you should move away from it because the context through which we receive something is important. And I firmly believe that anything that we do should create that sense of love and compassion, both for ourselves and for those around us. When I think of something that I consider demonic, I think that anything that moves us away from love is inherently demonic. So in that way, if someone says to me, there's something about what I'm bringing up in them that brings fear in them, then I would say, by all means, please move yourself away from it.
Mm.
Because I think that's the important thing that we often forget about healing, that when we're trying to heal someone, I always like to point this out. Medicine is called medicine because we decide how it's going to be used and to the best of its end. And I think in that way, you can look at the fact that one person's medicine could feel like another person's poison.
Mm.
So I think that often, even in that space, our own ability to recognize what feels like it is for us versus what feels like it's not for us is valuable and important. But I actually think that, as paradoxical as it seems, I feel like the idea of demonizing things in itself is inherently wrong because it's that moment of looking at something and saying that something is inherently evil that we allow that fear to come in. We allow that hate for something. We allow that hate for an other. So again, I try to really, it's always hard when those moments occur. I try to create those spaces of being educational, but I never push something too hard because and I'm sure
Yeah.
you've heard this. I'm sure you've heard this in my own readings, which is you don't heal someone that doesn't want to be healed because that's not healing.
Yeah.
That is not helping someone on their journey.
Yeah, and each person, everyone has to find their own points of alignment, whatever tools, methodology, meditation, whatever practices, prayer aligns with them most in order to, whatever striving towards a closer connection to God or whatever concept we have around our spiritual journey or religious background. I think we need to find the tools that align with it most. And so I'm curious about how you feel like tarot is helping you get closer to God on your own journey. I know you said you have a Catholic background and all of that. What is it about the deck and learning the deck? And I know you're also rigorously teaching each card one by one, what each card. So tell me about how it really does bring you and people closer to God on their spiritual journey.
Absolutely. As someone who's been rigorously studying the deck for over 30 years, and the joy and the frustration of the deck, and I even have people saying, why do you just stick to the Smith-Waite system? Because I can spend the rest of my life studying this deck and I'll never be finished.
That's the traditional deck, right?
I like to point out when we say traditional, there was a period where the deck had to go underground because after the 1400s, the church got wind that it was being used for divination and they were removed across the board from Europe. There was a revival in the early 1900s. And
Mm-hmm.
so the deck that we have now, the Smith-Waite system, or
Mm.
what is often called the Rider-Waite system, I don't like to call it the Rider-Waite system specifically because Pamela Coleman Smith's name is removed from it, and she's actually the person who created the cards. Surprise, the name
They
of the card
remember, yeah.
company is actually Rider. So they removed the name of the queer mystic who created them for the sake of the card company. So I always like to honor her name by calling it the Smith-Waite system. But one of the things that we see with that particular deck that was very important is they referenced some of the earliest decks that they could find. And also in the earlier Tarocchi decks, the numeric cards actually were not pictorial. They actually look very similar to our American playing card system. And we actually know that the American playing
Oh,
card system is a direct representation of the tarot because one of the
oh.
major arcana is still in it.
Yeah,
So,
I see them reading off of regular deck
yeah.
cards sometimes. That makes sense.
Mhm.
Yeah, interesting. Okay.
So in that way, one of the reasons I like to particularly teach from the Smith-Waite system is because of the attention to detail to both keeping the integrity of the most archaic cards that we could find, while
Mm.
also trying to take the numeric cards and show them in a way that makes it easier for the reader to interpret beyond just having the representations. And what's interesting about it is most decks today are built upon that. They're
Mm.
very much in that same, they're all just utilizing, not all of them, but a majority of them utilize the Smith-Waite as the base system. So I always like to tell people in my classes that as long as I can teach you this, I want to teach you this one, because if I teach you this one, you'll be able to pick up any deck and you'll be able to pick up the cues and know what that card means.
Yeah, and sometimes I'll hear Muslims say, oh, they'll pull like an oracle card, like from the angels, but they
Mhm.
won't touch the tarot. So do you
And
like any of that stuff too?
and I think again, I think that it has to do with the fact that I think that because there's not just a statement of what the meaning is, I feel like it can be a little bit more quixotic. I think it can feel a little bit more intimidating. In my own personal study of the cards themselves, I feel like every card is just an allegory. It's a parable. There's allegorical stories that are being represented in each card. And so one of the things I strive to teach when I'm teaching, and that's why I do these deep dives on each card, because I feel like the more you're able to understand the allegory or the parable of the card, the more you're able to interpret what that meaning is that you're supposed to be recognizing as it relates to your own personal journey. And so that in itself is another, like, that's perfect example of that demystification process, if you will, that I'm so focused on trying to shed light on for those who are more interested or invested in learning that additional point. Because like I said, it's not like there's not going to be some kind of intrinsic message and that takes you away from your own path work. I find that a lot of it is based on a lot of the same teachings that we find in multiple different faith practices and their holy books.
Yeah, like you mentioned, so you say consider yourself a mystic, right? What do you mean for people? Do you have a label like Christian mystic, or because I consider in Islam we have the Sufis, which is the mystical sect. So I would consider myself also mostly aligned in that way. We've had to learn through all the different sects. Yeah, where do you see alignment with being a mystic, and where does it align in your personal belief system with that?
Absolutely. So in relationality to mysticism, I feel like for me, the designation of mystic is one that I most adhere to because it, for me, is a dedication to being a perpetual student. And I feel like when you're a perpetual student doesn't say, I have to stay in this faith practice. I need to stay in alignment with this one. It requires that sense of being able to grab any book you need to be able to find the resource that you need to have. And I feel like if anything, that path work of following mysticism is one that's the idea of pursuing knowledge for the sake of understanding. It's almost, I believe it's almost like the veneration of that knowledge. And I feel like in a way, if I had to identify, what I believe God to be, like if we had to personify it in some way, I feel like that is like that. I feel like if I had to say if God was anything, I'd probably imagine that God was a library. And so I feel like that in the ability of identifying myself as a mystic, I am someone who worships that library.
Yeah, it's like the eternal path of knowledge, and you're always the student, never always learning. And the more you learn, the more you realize you have how
Yeah.
much farther you have to go on that, right?
It's very unforgivable. You're constantly feeling frustrated that you don't know enough.
Yeah, you don't know enough. And I definitely think, yeah, whenever we're getting in the rabbit hole of all of the different esoteric traditions and Gnostic tradition, whatever that might be, mystical traditions, like we were talking about earlier, people have to just go in the direction that aligns most with what their belief system is and all of that. And so I love what you're doing with the Tarot Church. And so are you trying to now bring everyone together to have a community of people who are in alignment with how tarot, like learning it, immersing themselves in it? Is this something that you're trying to create? Because I know you mentioned you have your clients. So I was curious if you're working people with one-on-one as well as on the community level, and how you're really building a stronger community that way.
Absolutely. So it's yes. So I'm working on many different levels right now. I do a lot of personal work with clients. And so my personal work varies in being as simple as doing kind of just standard readings when someone would like a reading to get some clarification on some matter in their life that I like to point out, giving them what they need to be able to make the decisions to help empower the direction that they're
Mhm.
moving towards. I also offer mentorship classes. So my mentorship classes are more personalized experiences. Those are ones where I effectively sit down with a student recognize and identify what their own personal goals are, or what their own, or even what their own spiritual pathwork is. Like a lot of the students that I build mentorship with are very similarly in that space where I believe they've reached a point in their own faith practice that they're very much coming into that state of individuating it for themselves. I do a lot of work in helping them facilitate recognizing and identifying what that path looks like as they proceed forward.
Yeah, let me ask you just about that, the transformation that people go through as they have mentorship with you. Like, how long are you working with someone? Like, what kind of months are
I
they?
always leave that
Yeah.
open to the client. I have some clients, so typically and it can vary to as little as a personal meeting so that we can come through and I can help them work through any immediate questions that they may have about something that they're experiencing on a spiritual level or trying to build a deeper practice for themselves. And then I have clients that I work with on a monthly basis. And so
Mhm.
those clients we either meet either once per week or to again navigate what they're encountering, what their spiritual hurdles are, what are those
Mm.
self-limiting beliefs. And again, because it's so individuated per client, it really does move in the direction of what it is that they're most invested in pursuing at that moment.
Yeah, they come to you with questions because I don't know what people will have challenge navigating our relationships and our work and things. And I know you mentioned how it's motivating people to overcome limiting beliefs or break through some of those barriers. I think also it's great to have support along the way, and it's like almost like a coaching type of situation at that point.
Absolutely. And especially because, and it's funny too, because the clients that work with me pick up on this when they start reading with me frequently, which is often there's always that question of time in the tarot, right? Everyone's always, when is it going to happen? And the thing is, I
Yeah.
always like to say, Spirit doesn't have a clock. Spirit doesn't have a wristwatch on its hand. When I ask those questions to Spirit, they always say, when this happens. And then I go, like, when's that going to happen? I go, whenever they want. But that question of whenever they want it's that simple answer to a profound like mystery of the self. I do a lot of help in helping my clients recognize and understand what those lessons are that they're trying to work through so that they can proceed effectively. And it's so interesting because I'll have some clients that will be like, every time they come back, we'll be like, we're still working on that hurdle. And then one day they'll show up and I'll just see this like light in their eyes and I'll be like, they're like, I got it. And I was like, excellent. And that's what's so difficult when we work in the space of personal breakthrough. You can't rush a breakthrough. I always like to point out, if you try to rush a breakthrough, you might have a breakdown in the process. That ability of helping someone as they go to navigate and recognize and come into those spaces of identifying. And again, it's not just that fact of saying that when things are going wrong around us, it's entirely our fault, but that ability of taking the approach necessary to be able to navigate those hurdles in ways that they haven't considered before or haven't perceived of. I like to believe that the best gift that I'm able to give my client is a different perspective, because often all we need to solve an energetic problem is a different perspective.
Yeah, that is so true, especially when we're dealing with the polarities of masculine and feminine energy. And if we're already in tune to areas where we're maybe need to have more empathy for our partners and what's creating those frictions and those blockages, I think having the second perspective is really beneficial. And being able to ask and answer questions and talk through what energetically is happening and then relate it to our own individual story that's happening in our life at that moment so that we can overcome that. Yeah, I definitely love that. And I love the community that you're building. Like we mentioned, I know that you are catering to people who both are brand new to tarot or who are longtime tarot users already. Are you also finding that people want to come into your tarot church so that they can themselves also become readers and that kind of thing as well?
It's a really great question. And that's also what I love about tarot. So, one of the things that I do for those clients or for those who participate in Tarot Church who become founding members is I actually
Mm.
offer a complimentary mentorship class. And that class is a one-on-one private class that I have with them, wherein I sit and we talk together and I find out what's brought them to tarot. Because the interesting thing and this is why, again, my love of the deck is so profound. There are those who come to the tarot simply for the sense of wanting to have that personal connection with the cards. They don't ever have that desire to read. They don't ever have that
Mm,
interest. It's just for themselves. And then I have some clients that feel like that real sense of calling within them. They have that urge, they have that desire, they feel that sense of purpose. And in which case, depending on what my clients want and what they feel their connection to tarot is. And then sometimes I have clients who aren't necessarily even sure. They're just in that space of introducing themselves to the deck. I appreciate being able to have that one-on-one time because we're really able to drill down so I can understand what is best. It also helps me inform the classes I'm teaching because not only does it help me recognize and understand the challenges that they're facing in their personal path work, I can also tell them, like, I can give them effectively what they need potentially outside of the class to help facilitate what we're learning in a way that helps them with their own personal practice.
Yeah, I love that because it's almost like you're getting proficient at your at-home tool for what you can do. You're learning about what you can do at home in order to get answers for yourself, right? Because I think a lot of us, we maybe religions have that problem too, where we don't want to have intermediaries between ourselves and God. In fact, you're not trying to advocate like, oh, I'm going to be your intermediary and tell you what's going on, but you're actually teaching people to use it for themselves and increase that connection to God directly and make it stronger at the home or whatever, wherever they might be or whatever they might be trying to do.
Absolutely, in every way, shape, and form. It's very much like I say in relationality to working with guides, which is a good guide will never tell you what to do. A good guide will give you a map, they'll give you some water, they'll give you some snacks, they'll help you recognize where you are, and then they'll say, where do you want to go? Like, where do you want to go? And that's a lot of the work that I try to do with my clients is I try to help them facilitate that path work of coming into personal connection. And I always articulate that I'm there for them in as much as a need and desire they would like me to have, or as little. And what's interesting too, because that's often a question that I've had this question asked to me on multiple occasions, which is how often should I have a reading? And I always tell those who ask me that, I'm like, there's no question I can give you that's an easy one, because I know some clients who they can have a reading every week and that's what they need. It feels strong and empowering. The one thing I always think that I'm very mindful of, and I even tell my own clients of this, is if I ever feel like there's something that I'm doing with them that's moving them away from helping, I will be the first one to say it. I will be the first
Mm.
one to articulate it, because I always like to point out that if you want a tarot reading, I am here for it. If you start saying to me, you need a tarot reading,
Oh,
you need one, then I'm going to start saying, maybe you don't, right? Because that sense of creating that space of feeling empowered is not one that I don't want it to feel like a crutch. I want it to feel like it's a pair of wings. So.
amazing. Yeah, because it gets a bad rap going to fortune teller, tarot readers, like you're going to get these answers. And I feel like we have to have our discernment and we want to work with people who are not going to make us feed into that need more and more. Like they're like that's what we're talking about, being having an intermediary between you and God versus having abilities on your own. And I think what you're doing is amazing because it's breaking down like the types of readers that maybe we should be working with versus those that maybe we shouldn't be working with. And when you're able to have such proficiency in like knowledge of how it works and why it works, then you really feel like the information you're getting and the training and the tools is in alignment with where we what we should be doing. So I just love that so much.
Thank you. And again, I think that's also another aspect of the service I do, because I feel like even in the sense of someone, even the service of those who don't choose to read, I think that having the empowerment and understanding how something works creates that sense of, as you said, being able to vet for what feels like it helps versus what
Yeah.
feels like it doesn't.
Yeah, amazing. All right. Thank you so much, Cyn. And tell me, where do you want people to go who want to work with you? Or I know you have the Tarot Church group and as well as your TikTok, which is where I see you most of the time every day. But where's the best place for people to go who want to find you and learn more about all of this?
Absolutely. And thank you so much for having me. If you are interested in potentially learning more about Tarot Church and our classes, I would encourage you to visit my Substack, greystrega.substack.com. We teach the monthly classes over on that Substack. We're actually having one tonight. We're going to be focusing on the Lover's card.
Oh,
Paid
amazing.
subscribers, I'm very excited to teach it.
1010. It's the lover's card. Okay.
Exactly. It's perfect. And also your subscription gives you full access to the full repository of the previous classes. So even if we've had about 6 hours worth of classes so far, so they're there for anyone who becomes a part of the classes perusal. I also, if you're interested in coming to our daily collective reads. I also on the Substack post a newsletter weekly. So if you even become just a follower instead of a paid subscriber, you'll have access to my newsletter, which will let both about my live event schedule as well as my in-person events. I also post the podcast on Substack of each day's daily collective read for those who can't catch it live on TikTok. That can be found on Substack. It's also streamed to Spotify at Tarot Church. And if you prefer to watch the full video of each day's daily collective read, you can find it over on my YouTube at Grey Strega.
Oh, you're
If
YouTube,
you'd like to
right.
find me on TikTok, of course, to see the daily collectives live, we read them about, I'd say 6 times, 6 days out of the week, typically.
Yeah,
5 or 6 days out of
amazing.
the week. You can
For
find me on TikTok at Grey Strega. And please remember, I always need to say this. If you follow me, remember, I will never reach out to you for a reading. There are a lot of imposters, so I just like to give that warning.
Yes, of course. And I think that's what becomes most important when we're on TikTok or the social media. It's like everyone's trying to reach out or you're getting these fake readers. But I think it really starts by listening every day, finding someone like yourself who you feel like you start to learn how this is working and then reach out for readings is the best way to go because we want to protect ourselves and work with the right people. So, yeah, I love everything you do. I definitely try and listen to the collective readings as much as I can. It's helped me a lot. And yeah, so any final thoughts or words of wisdom you like to leave our audience with before we wrap up?
I'd say more than anything right now, I know the world is a really crazy place right now. And I like to reaffirm, and I feel as it relates to spirituality or just each other in general, I'm going to refer to what Mr. Rogers said, which is always look for the helpers. You'll know someone's there to help because they want to help. And remember to extend that same level of compassion to everyone around you right now.
Yeah, and we're all in the same one big neighborhood of humanity, right?
Exactly.
Collective consciousness, unified field, we're all connected. Yeah, I love that for everyone and sending prayers to all the difficulties right now that we're experiencing. But yeah, remembering that we're all connected and what Mr. Rogers taught us. I love that.
And
All
again,
right.
thank you so much, dear. This was such a pleasure. And it's an honor
Yeah.
to be able to have this conversation with you.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Talk to you soon.
Take
Bye bye.
care.